So we can get started. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. This is another very exciting book interview. And today I'm very happy to have James Stauch here with us. My name is Yasmin. I'm going to be your host for today. And I have a quick, very, very brief presentation as an introduction for us to get started. And then I'll pass it over to James for us to start the interview. Please let me know if you are seeing my screen, if you have any problems. Can you see my screen? Yeah, perfect. Great. So yeah, again, hello, my name is Yasmin, and today we are hosting the Learn and Create Your Systemic Toolkit, the 55 minutes with James Stauch. And a quick context to where we're coming from. So I am part of the Bristol Hub from the Systems Innovation Network. This is the core team, me and Carl, who's in the call here as well, James and Hannah. We are the core team of the Bristol Hub. And this is just uh, one of the hubs within the network of hubs in the Systems Innovation Network. So I really appreciate you all coming here. But it's also good to know that there are other hubs, other groups of amazing people doing systems innovation across the globe, but also across different themes. So please check them out because they are amazing. And essentially, these hubs are groups of people talking about systems innovation and doing systems innovation in different areas and different geographical locations across the globe. So please check them out in the Systems Innovation website. So for our session today, I am going to quickly introduce the speaker and then go to our agenda for today. So James Stauch has authored and co-authored many guides, scans, and trend analysis on a range of contemporary social issues. A social innovation and systems change educator and practitioner based in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, Canada. He serves as a co-chair of the Banff Systems Summit and as Complex Systems Strategist with ATCO SpaceLab. James is a visiting fellow at the Skoll Centre at the Saïd Business School, University of Oxford, and was the founding executive director of the Institute for Community Prosperity at Mount Royal University, where he developed social innovation, leadership, and systems-focused learning programs for undergraduate students and the broader community. So this is one that we cannot miss this session today. And of course, today we're talking about his new book, The 55 Minutes, which we're going to start very, very soon. So thank you very much, James, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Yasmin. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick agenda before we jump in. So these are the 5 minutes introduction that we have here. Then we are going to hear from James for 20 minutes about his book and how he started developing this atlas, which is very, very impressive. Then I'm going to ask a couple of questions for 30 minutes. Then I'll pass it over to you as an open Q&A moment. And we are going to have a 5-minute wrap up in the end. So just a housekeeping moment. Please remember that this session is being recorded and is going to be available in our YouTube channel afterwards. During the session, the chat function is going to be available. So please put your questions, comments there, and we're going to look at it throughout the session. And for the better audio experience, please mute yourself if you're not speaking, but don't be shy. If you want to address any comments or questions, use the digital hand or your physical hand, and we're going to pass it over to you. Okay? So that's it for me. So over to James. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you also to the Bristol Hub for hosting this call and providing a platform for really for a global audience, and really wonderful to see people from all over the world. So I'm just gonna make sure that my slides are working okay. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Great. Perfect. Oh, and also, I'm just going to pop into the chat for 2 seconds and include the link for the book that I'll be talking about. Okay, so I'm speaking to you today from Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral present and future territory of the Mi'kmaq people, um, just across the Atlantic, a few time zones away from where Yasmin is. Um, I I also just want to do a bit of a shout out to the SI network as a whole. The tools, the guides, the webinars, the all the explainers, the many other resources available through the network have not only, I think, helped advance the work of systems practitioners all over the world, but importantly, I think have really helped kind of make the membrane between like system scholarship and practice on the ground, whether that's in in government or in the private sector, in philanthropy and education, healthcare, many more places. It's made that kind of membrane much more permeable, and there's lots of back and forth that's permitted by or that's enabled through the SI network. So I think that's a really, really important service and contribution. Um, and, we've selected many of the tools, concepts, frameworks that, from places as diverse as organizational behavior and anthropology and ecosystem biology, urban planning, adult education, policy analysis, um, the philosophy of science, many other fields, and um, and I think that the SI network has similarly drawn from a wide ambit and made many of those tools, concepts, frameworks super approachable, super understandable. So thank you for that. And the experiences that I've kind of accumulated in my career, which started out in planning, urban planning. I worked in philanthropy for a dozen years, in post-secondary education for a dozen years, and now much more closely with the private sector as well. I've worked a lot with Indigenous communities in various parts of Canada. And it's all of those experiences have led me to conclude that without a systems perspective, um, and a kind of unrelenting curiosity about what systems are, how they work, I've come to believe that we can neither understand nor intervene smartly in the world around us. We can't just plan our way to a better future. Whether that's urban futures or more broadly, we cannot be innovative problem solvers if we don't understand the problems we are claiming to solve. And we cannot achieve objectives like decolonization without rewiring how we think. And that includes things like higher education. Um, you know, uh, we've exported a model from Europe that was developed over the last few hundred years. And I'll talk a little bit later about how challenges to that model intersect in really interesting ways with systems thinking and systems approaches. Um, so the 55 minutes is what we call an atlas to navigate problems, reveal systems, and ask beautiful questions in a radically shifting world. It's a 20-chapter resource, so it's a pretty thick book, about 570 pages, for mainly designed for practitioners working in any sector. That could be in any industry, in any organizational type, and in really any context, who are interested in using systems tools, systems concepts, systems frameworks, um, to approach and tackle difficult problems. And so it's really kind of, for those who say, well, the system's broken, or the system is rigged, or, the problem I'm dealing with is a systemic problem. This is a guide to better understanding those systems. But more than that, it's really it's really an appeal to slow down because of the urgency and the complexity of so many of our problems. We actually can't have, even if we are having a kind of action bias and we want to get on top of the problem, this is an appeal to really slow down and think carefully. So the title of the book, let me just see if my slides advance properly. Oh. Let's see. Okay, that works. So the title of the book takes its inspiration from an alleged Albert Einstein aphorism. When asked if he was given an hour to solve a difficult problem and his life depended on it, that he would take the first 55 minutes to just think about the problem, to ask questions about the problem, and only the last 5 minutes acting to solve or do anything about the problem in an actionable way. But the reality is that most of us live or work in contexts where the dominant culture invests and places value on that last 5 minutes, where most of our organizations, our institutions are incentivized to act. And that might be through, for example, design or invention or regulation or venture capital, venture creation, many other forms of intervention. So we work in solutions-driven companies. The suffix solution is among the most common suffixes chosen for tech companies, tech company names. Governments are under constant pressure due to election cycles, shrinking attention spans, and shrinking political lifespans to deliver rapid fixes to difficult problems. But all too frequently, those end up being fixes that fail. Student learning in our schools and our institutions are driven by metrics where knowing the right answer, solving a problem in a correct way, is more important than asking new and beautiful questions. So our dominant approach to education tends to produce what crisis management experts Ian Mitroff and Ken Aspelin call certainty junkies, which is a kind of intellectual narcissism cultivated through years of exercise-based learning rather than problem-based learning. And of course, the kind of Zuckerbergian maxim of move fast and break stuff has now come to define not just commercial or technological innovation, but geopolitics. And it's creating instability, it's adding risk, and not just economic or environmental risk, but really existential risk. So the book is shot through with short stories, anecdotes, lessons learned from our collective experience. It's meant to be instructive, but not instructional. It's not a step-by-step guide to arriving at a correct answer for how to intervene in the system. And unfortunately, because it's a book, books have this one constraint where it's linear, right? There's chapters that follow chapters that follow chapters. The text is linear. And so the medium doesn't really reflect the message. That's why we've kind of cheekily chosen this title of Atlas to communicate that it's really more of a reference book. You can start anywhere, and hopefully you won't be lost. I'll give you some tips and pointers as to where might be helpful to start based on where you're coming from and what your situation is. But I would say like the experiences that I have had in, whether it's commercial innovation, in philanthropy, social entrepreneurship, education, they are all marked by this kind of like expectation that we need to rush to action. We need to ideate, design, and implement a solution without taking a step back and asking, well, what might be the real problem that underlies this problem? Is this problem a symptom of another problem? What is producing and sustaining the negative outcome in the first place? What are its roots? What are its origins? Who benefits from the status quo? What's the inevitable result of doing nothing, and so on? So these are kind of the kinds of questions that we want you to dive into and to interrogate the problem with. It's why we wrote the book and leaned into that 55-minute metaphor. And by the way, the book is available as a free PDF download if you go to the55minutes.com. And it's free. We made it free because we have a collective interest in making sure this is broadly made available. And both of our producing partners are fully committed to that and really keen to see this used broadly and widely. And we're standing on the shoulders of giants. So many of the tools in here well, most of the tools are not our tools. And so it's a compendium of knowledges and techniques that were developed by others. It's pieced together in hopefully a novel and helpful way, but far be it from us to unduly profit from the book. So many of you know, you've probably seen this already, but the World Economic Forum, in its jobs report, Future of Jobs report, that came out earlier this year, employers, this is interesting because, these are mainly private sector employers, but they're citing systems thinking as a core skill expected to increase in importance over the next 5 years. So the list of vocations, the list of careers that can benefit from being curious about systems, tools, concepts, frameworks is very, very long. We believe that to be a good economist, for example, you must be a good systems thinker. You cannot be a good economist without being a systems thinker. Effective corporate government leaders must also be good systems thinkers. So must designers, policy analysts, teachers, social workers, community development practitioners, doctors, other health practitioners. The list goes on and on. And I reject the idea that only sort of systems natives or a systems community or of systems scholars are capable of being excellent systems thinkers. Which, by the way, in North America, there's a very, very tiny and pretty invisible community of systems scholars. So it's probably more consideration for Europe and the UK. I'm now working mainly in a private sector context. ATCO is a global engineering and logistics company employing about 20,000 people, nearly 5 billion in annual revenue, which is about 2.6 billion in pounds sterling. It's perhaps best known as the world's third largest provider of modular housing. And as a business interested in corporate longevity and as a family-controlled enterprise, it's very interested in legacy for generations to come. And so the company is trying to understand, well, how current trends, faint signals portend to what kind of context it'll be operating in years from now, and what kind of practices, well beyond the kind of like innovation theater that is, everywhere today, actually creates real innovation, greater likelihood of longevity, better talent attraction, and so on. So concepts that are kind of aligned with systems thinking, such as the maxim, the stability of the parts creates instability of the whole, or concepts like requisite variety, futures capabilities, adaptive capacity, landscape awareness. These are all really important to building resilience and anti-fragility within the organization. They're concepts that any organization should be alive to. So in a way, it's fundamentally about sustainability, their interest, but not from an ESG driven point of view. It's really much more from a kind of existentially driven notion of sustainability. And that, to me, I think, in my experience, is exceedingly rare in the corporate world. ATCO's SpaceLab is an enterprise-wide framework of support for employees with the desire and creative energy to pursue sustainable new value for the company. Now, SpaceLab integrates a range of problem understanding or systems understanding tools as an alternative to what they see as kind of a dominant mode of innovation support in the broader culture today. So where the emphasis tends to be on ideation, design, implementation. And what happens in that world is you spend the bulk of your time and energy on rationalizing why the idea, why the design is the right one, even if or even as you may be solving for the wrong problem. So ATCO is really trying to take a step back and say, whether you're interested in like energy transmission or natural disaster logistics and remediation or any other number of interests that are aligned with the company, do you really understand the problem? Do we really have a handle on the nature of the problem or the nature of the problem that underlies that problem? And so like going back to that Zuckerbergian move fast and break stuff, it's action without learning that they're trying to kind of re-inject learning into the action piece. When you're dealing with broader social systems, and this includes like finance, systems of finance and commerce and supply chains and anything involving human beings, when you move fast and break stuff, you're breaking human beings. And so, it is easier to sort of prototype and to have kind of minimum viable products in a tech innovation context, but it's not translatable to most other contexts, including many other commercial contexts. So the solve first, ask questions later innovation culture we find also found its way into post-secondary in business schools, in life sciences and engineering schools, within universities, colleges, polytechnics. And in a response to this, my co-author, Daniela Pappy-Thornton, created about 10 years ago a competition, a global student competition, when she was deputy director of the Skoll Centre at Oxford, which is very much unlike the parade of pitch competitions, business case competitions, design sprints, hackathons, those kinds of things that you see the world over. Map the System awards students not for their solution idea, but instead for their understanding of the problem, and moreover, viewed through a systems lens. So it's a problem understanding and systems mapping competition, which is not very sexy, but when viewed in the light of many other competitions that nurture that kind of false sense of heropreneurship, it's a really necessary addition to the landscape of the student experience, and one that I believe is also more likely to attract future CEOs, political leaders, movement builders, transformative future researchers and public intellectuals. Those are the kinds of students that are attracted to Map the System. So Daniela and I, and along with Anna Johnson, we developed back in 2019 an open access guide to students to help them achieve maximum success in this competition. We discovered that practitioners from many walks of life, to our surprise, were also using this guide. So not just students, and they were using it in their workplaces, and they were saying to us, "Hey, are you gonna create a practitioner's guide to mapping a system at some point?" Now, the actual title, Practitioner's Guide to Mapping a System, would be sleep-inducing. So, we helpfully, very helpfully and serendipitously and catalytically, we developed this relationship with ATCO that led to reframing it as the 55 minutes and saying, look, this isn't a guide to systems mapping so much as it is a guide to problem understanding. And that's the thing that we think people care about. So chapter 1 of the book, because of the really wide ambit and aim of who this is trying to appeal to, You know, everyone from journalists to policy analysts to health professionals to teachers and artists and so on. We managers of all stripes. We in chapter one is basically how to use this book. Where do you begin, and how do you maximize your use of this book, depending on where you're at? So, like, are you working in a team? Are you doing this within an organizational context or framework? Do you already have like an idea that you're kind of in love with, and that you've been building or designing or working on? What I would say is if you're just reading the book for leisure or for pleasure, skip chapter one, go right to chapter two. But if you're doing it in a work context, definitely spend some time with chapter one. The lion's share of the book is divided into two main sections. One we call foundations and the other we call tools. So I'll talk about tools in a moment, but I'll spend a bit of time with foundations first. Foundations is basically a set of capacities that are kind of the basics of systems practice, or problem understanding. What even is a system? You know, what are some of the important features of systems? What ways of working constitute good systems practice, and so on. And following this, we challenge readers to hang up their preordained or pre-developed or pre-loved, preconceived solution. And we also offer some guidance for how to reframe problems, how to explore complexity, how to develop a richer picture of the problem itself, how to research your topic, what are the merits and perils of map making and complexity. So those are a lot of the kind of foundational pieces before we dive into very specific tools. In his excellent book, The Grammar of Systems Practice, Patrick Hoverstadt notes that for most people, most of the time, it doesn't matter that the Earth is a sphere. But once you know it's a sphere, you can't unthink that. So that's a really interesting parallel for thinking in systems. And we see this with students all the time. So thinking of the world as filled with systems upon systems upon systems is kind of like this. Like you don't need to notice until you try and navigate at sufficient scale or insufficient complexity, where coming face to face with this complexity can either overwhelm you or be an invitation to look anew at the world. So we find that like students who are exposed to the tools, concepts, frameworks in this book regularly report a complete shift in how, for example, they see the news. And so, you know, they ask questions like, well, what's not being shared about the framing of this story? Or what is assumed in this story? Or what's the background? What's the backstory? Where are the maps? And so on. And so we explore like what does systems thinking ask us to draw on, develop, and deploy? What ways of thinking or working help us become essentially great mappers, quote unquote, of systems, like cartographers of complexity. And so this list here is a list of subheadings in chapter 3. Each of these capacities has its own description and an anecdote to help illustrate what we mean by this concept. This is probably not a very new list to the people on this call, I'm guessing. You would probably come up with a list very similar to this or very adjacent to this. I'm not gonna belabor it. However, I'm gonna zero in on one of these competencies before we move on to tools. And you know, you'll frequently read. So backing up, the one that we're focusing on is systems thinking is not new. You'll frequently read, especially in the UK and European literature, that systems thinking emerged sometime after World War II, roughly contiguous with the emergence of cybernetics, and on the periphery of sort of discipline-bound modes of research inquiry and inquiry. But But now, of course, it has its own like decades-old scholarly canon. Taking nothing away from these scholarly contributions, which are significant and which we refer extensively to in the book, we, however, firmly believe that systems thinking is not new, and that most cultures throughout most of human history were naturally inclined to nurture this way of thinking. So Indigenous thinkers and scholars have been reminding us that for many, many decades, in Canada at least, that everything really is connected, that it's systems all the way up and all the way down. So the push to revolutionize how we approach scholarship so that we embrace systems practice is I mean, the major force for that is the push and pull, at least in Canada, of what we call decolonization and indigenization. So Indigenous modes of learning blend the sort of experience-based or phenomenological, the kind of values-based or axiological, and epistemological, something that, you know, post-secondaries and education systems are already very good at. But this is to say that Indigenous knowledge systems bring in other modes of learning, like more embodied, ethically driven, and practice-based. They bring different assumptions and mental models, and they ultimately bring other ways of coming to interpret and understand the world around us, other ways of knowing, if you like. So one important feature, and I think a defining feature, following the repatriation of our constitution from the UK, is a society-wide effort to reconcile the conquest, the systems that aimed to eradicate language, culture, economic livelihoods, human dignity. Institutions of higher learning have also been part of this reexamination. I think we are still in a kind of protozoan stage with this. We are having really good conversations, but real change is happening incrementally and slowly. But you know, there is additional space for Indigenous scholars, Indigenous instructors, administrators, and of course students. But also, and I think this is a really much more significant challenge, pedagogy, new pedagogies, things like traditional ecological knowledge, more, I guess, heterodox pathways to insight and interpretation. I think ultimately this is going to expand what we think of as the liberal arts. Like, what does it require to practice the art of liberty in a complex and radically shifting world? So it's very exciting, but also like we're fumbling in the dark and finding our way, you know, like babes in the woods. So a couple of things that I wanted to focus on here. One is, so there's a number of different Indigenous frameworks that are useful, I think, to thinking about systems. One of them comes from a Mi'kmaq concept of two-eyed seeing, where one metaphorical eye sees the best that Western Enlightenment has to offer, while the other metaphorical eye, the Indigenous eye, let's say, offers the best of non-Western ways of learning. And there's a similarity in some ways to the insights of UK psychiatrist, philosopher, neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist, who's highlighted the distinctions between how the left and right hemispheres attend to the world or attend to reality. So that kind of left hemisphere, our Western eye, if you like, helps us map, model, analyze, count, linguistically categorize, while the right hemisphere, that would be the sort of Indigenous eye, if you like, helps us synthesize, see connections, see wholes, see the broader context, see flows and dynamism across much vaster timescales. And so the combination of those two is really, really useful to systems thinking. A story that was shared with us for the book by Siksika or Blackfoot elder Roy Bearchief. He gifted us a creation story that he's permitted us to recount in the book and about talking about the book. The story tells of a giant spider web who created the world as a web to which every person, every being, every object, every particle is connected. As Bear Chief describes it, he, the creator, instructed Anito PC to wrap the world with the people in it in his web and let them down to the lower world. Anito PC did as he was told and let them down from the upper world through a hole. The web that Anito PC spun is a metaphor for the systems that connect us. So when something is amiss in the system, someone's in trouble, the web vibrates. So this story, it has implications. It has analogs in many cultures. Indra's web in Buddhist cosmology, for example. And in Blackfoot cosmology, not unlike the frontiers of quantum field theory, the essence of reality is not particles, but relationships, interconnections, interdependence. So quantum field theory posits that particles are understood as localized vibrations or excitations within fundamental fields that permeate all of space-time. A spider web is about as close a metaphor as you can find of this insight about the fundamental nature of reality. Another example that I just wanted to briefly touch on it comes from a different context, but it again reinforces this notion of systems thinking is not new. So this is a photo on the right of Inuk hunter and guide Mika Mike, who led a group of European, American, and Canadian funders and Inuit elders on a learning journey to the flow edge off Baffin Island. Now, the topic for discussion was to be Arctic governance. The trip was delayed by a few hours due to weather, which the funders thought would be a perfect time to talk about governance. You know, we can do the governance now, and then we can do the fun thing after. We even had access to a really lovely boardroom, but Mika insisted that we wait. So many hours later, across many kilometers of ice, we made it to the flow edge, that open water gap where the landfast ice meets the ice drifting on ocean currents. There we harvested a seal. We shared it we jointly partook in the eating of the animal in accordance with traditional protocols. And once the animal was consumed, we could talk about governance. So Mika said, those are systems of governance. When you think of the systems, you know, the circumpolar accords and institutions, the multilateral, the constitutional, those are systems of governance that have been designed, she pointed out, by humans. This, referencing the seal, the ice, the wind, the water, is the deeper system of which we are a part and why we must, and to which we must abide. Inuk researcher Shirley Tagalik, in writing about Inuit Kawi Mayatu Kangit, which is translated roughly as that which we have always known to be true, notes that Inuit knowledge systems are grounded in this all-encompassing holistic view of an interconnected world, a world that is imbued with and defined through relationship and interactivity. Everything is known by its relationship to everything else. There is a universal wholeness of relationship, and no one thing can be separated from the view of the whole. That is a significant epistemological challenge to everything we kind of have been exposed to in Western education. And so that I really thought was worth spending a little bit of extra time on as one of the many, many different mindsets that we cover in the book. Just before I quickly take you through tools, two little heuristics that my colleague Daniela developed, I think are worth touching upon. The first is in order to kind of like try and put the solution bias to bed or put it aside, We want to tell people, look, it's okay that you may have an idea that you are really, really keen to design or start or scale up or borrow. And we have an entire chapter to urging you to put that idea on pause while you embark on this journey of problem understanding. And so we actually have an exercise when we do workshops on this. We have an exercise with students or with practitioners where we literally ask people to put their solution on a piece of paper, fold it up, origami style, into a t-shirt that is hung up for the duration of the process. Note that it's not putting it in the garbage or burning it or something like that. The point is that the idea may well have merit. So we won't destroy it, but let's hang it up for a while. The other little simple heuristic that we've developed is this SOS sandwich idea. So think about the metaphor of a sandwich. As you're piecing it together in the journey to understand, map, and ultimately act to intervene in a system, the two layers of bread represent the subjective components, and the fillings are the objective ingredients that you sort of layer on to make the sandwich as nutrition rich or insight rich as possible. Otherwise, you're just doing empty calories. If you just have the two layers of bun, which is how we do most innovation, it's empty calories. There's not much to it. So, it's the orientation towards objective understanding that is the 55 minutes. However, it's important to note that this is a vector. This is not a destination. You're never going to arrive at objective understanding in any kind of universally verifiable way. But you will approach more objective understanding by using the many various tools that we use in the book. So this is really the meat of the book when we start to get into the tools. We've structured these tools into 11 families grouped around 11 key questions that sprawl across 11 chapters. And we've appropriated this kind of analog clock image to basically say, hey, this is the 55 minutes. And so these categories, very briefly, are frame, landscape, roots, origins, futures, experience, relationships, power, causality, narrative, and leverage. So that's the 55 minutes. With only one exception, the 30 tools that we explain have been developed by others, not us. And they've been in use for typically many, many years, in some cases, many decades. As I say, they've come from many different fields and many different professional minds and sets of experiences. And we are standing on the shoulders of giants. But with each and every one of these 30 tools, we give an overview of the tool, we describe how we've used it, and we have some basic instructions for how to try it out. And basic this isn't a facilitation guide. It doesn't say, grab X number of pieces of flip chart paper and X number of pens and, provide 1.5 hours and so on and so forth. It doesn't get into that level of granular detail. It provides you enough to say, hey, you could take this, you could remix it, you could recombine it, consider combining it with another tool over here, depending on your context. We don't want to get precious about these tools. These are simply a range of tools that we surface to consider for your consideration. We do have a chapter on acting, which I really won't talk about, but it's there and it's chapter 20. And but the heart of the book is really, again, about problem understanding. So let me just do a quick time check. Okay, I'll quickly burn through these. I know we're a little over time. Under the frame chapter, the question here is, where do we focus and how do we set boundaries? We actually played with a camera metaphor when we first started writing the book, because you actually get to pick the boundaries of the problem. No one is going to tell you, no, there's no universal truth about where does a health system begin and end, right? What's in scope and what's out of scope? Is nutrition a part of that? Is parenting a part of a health system? Like, is school a part of a health system? Depending on who you ask, you get a different answer. And so but the framing has to make sense for the purposes, what Donella Meadow says, for the purposes of the discussion. So under this section, we talk about the 5 Rs, we talk about the problem framing canvas as general tools for framing. The next section is what we call landscape. And here, this is trying to understand the topography or the contours of the system. So this is where we lean into, to topographic ideas and metaphors like basins of attraction or tipping points. Here we use Daniela's Impact Gaps Canvas as one of the tools, Schott and Gilles' multi-level perspective, asset mapping, which has a whole tradition that comes from the work of John McKnight and others in terms of appreciative and asset-based community development. We dive into roots using Pinia, Kramer, and Sengi's 6 conditions, iceberg model, 5 Whys that came out of the Toyota and Taiichi Ohno's work. Origins, really important to not be ahistoric when we look at any problem. We need to understand, well, how did this even begin? How did this even become to be a problem? Was it always a problem? This can be extremely powerful, even though timelines can be very simple tools or change over time graphs. They cannot be ignored. They're really important parts of filling out the dimensionality of systems. But of course, systems are not just dependent on linear time. They're dependent on more circular cycles. So obviously, ecosystems are classic examples of cyclical systems or seasonal systems. But you actually find that human systems and human organizations of many different types and scales also follow a kind of seasonality or cyclicality. We talk about a number of futures tools because it's just as it's important to look in the back, in the rearview mirror, it's important to look ahead. Not for predictive purposes, but for to ask the question, like, what happens if we do, like, what's the inevitable result of doing nothing about this particular problem? Where is this going to be headed if we don't do anything or if we do something inadequate? And secondly, aspirationally, like what actually is a kind of city on a hill that we aspire to, so that we actually understand that's part of defining why a problem is a problem, because you can see some other vision of the future where this problem doesn't exist. And so there are many tools that we cover that are again, I should mention many of these tools, by the way, such as backcasting here. These are tools that you can download explainers, look at videos, see guides for through the SI network. And we've actually used SI Network's version with permission of a couple of these tools because they're so well explained. We're like, well, we're not going to do better than that. And so I really encourage you to explore the SI Network's tools if you haven't already. We talk about experience. This is those who are living the system, whether they are who the system is intending to benefit or who is working in the system and toiling in the system. So journey maps, ethnography, relationships, who's who in the zoo and how are they connected? What's the nature of their connection? So here we explore various types of actor and network maps. Power is a really important one. There are some classic tools. Some of these are decades old. Some of them are quite new. There are many dimensions of power that we explore a little bit. There's power based on incentive. There's power based on position. There's power based on access to voice, access, and agency, and so on. The causality is, of course, the logic of the system. There are some who kind of think of this as systems mapping. And in a dynamical way, these are really important pieces, but causality mapping cannot show you the whole picture of a system, in part because causality tends to collapse into a kind of determinism if you're not really careful about it. And the opposite of that results in really complex spaghetti network type diagrams. So we cautiously approach this article, and this chapter, it's a very lengthy chapter. Um, but we also are very emphatic that you can think in systems and be a systems practitioners without having to use these particular tools or this particular family of tools. Nonetheless, it's still really important to explore and to play with these tools. Narrative, even more important, arguably, the story of the system. And so we use two tools in here in particular: causal layer analysis, developed by Sohai and Inayatullah, and Rich Pictures. One is like one of the simplest tools of all 30 that we cover, and the other is one of the more complex ones. And then finally, leverage, where in the system might change be possible. And here we revisit impact gaps. We look at leverage points developed by Donella Meadows. We looked at various theories of change models. And then ultimately, we, after, and again, this is presenting it as unnecessarily linear. You don't have to start with frame. You can start anywhere you want, anywhere that interests you. And throughout, you will find that you are reframing and refining what the problem really is. If you're doing it well, and if you're getting quality inputs and insights from these processes. So ultimately, at some point, yes, you get to a point where you're like, okay, I feel like I can do something about this. You may not actually. You may realize that you may come to a realization that, you know what, my best contribution is actually in the information providing space. Or I'm on such a different problem now that this old problem, I'm moving on from it. This isn't the problem at all. But for the most part, you will come to this kind of last subjective slice of bread. And we do not include a guide to how to act. We simply include points for discussion and for thinking about as you're pursuing the action phase, to make sure you continually reference your system's insights and your problem understanding insights. There's lots of guides, whether it's lean startup, whether it's design thinking, whether it's, there's many different ways, policy development and so on, that you can intervene. We do not cover the gamut of modes of intervention. This isn't a book about how to intervene, but we do kind of draw some connections back to, well, what does this mode of action have to do with understanding the problem? So that's the book in a nutshell. Again, I encourage you to share it widely, to order your own copy or download your own copy. Reach out to me with any questions or comments. And yeah, thank you for indulging me in the extra time. Sorry about that, Yasmin.
No worries, James. The almost 600 pages book, so yes, it's worth spending time into it and digging deeper into the details. Thank you very much for the presentation. And yeah, we'll just I normally at this time ask some questions about the book. But today I wanted to do something a bit different, dynamic, that I haven't done before. But I think it would be very interesting to have James's perspective on some of the complex scenarios that I've heard many times, and I'm sure all of you have, in some way or another, have heard or experienced yourselves, and seeing James's take on these challenges, and maybe what are some of the tools in the book that could help starting to think deeper about the problem, right? We're here in the 55 minutes. So what are the tools that allow us to ask better questions about the problem and distill maybe the juice of the problem before we actually act on it. So I do time. I will just choose. I put 6 topics or 6 challenges, but I will choose maybe 2 or 3 for us to get started. So just to summarize this dynamic, I will put a specific complex challenge that I think, yeah, either I've been through or I've heard people going through, and what are some of the tools and ideas that could be important for us to think about the problem in a different way, or think about them, ask other questions or deeper questions about them. So the first scenario will be in this area of speed and fast results and quick outcomes and everything like that. We need to go into this mode of learn, action, reflection, learn, action, reflection, and so forth. And that takes time, right? That takes some maybe, yeah, individuals thinking about ideas that maybe we don't have, quote unquote, the time that we need, or everything's moving so fast that we can't even stop to think about it. So, James, what is your take on this challenge that I'm sure lots of us have been through, and maybe some tools that could help us reframe or rethink about this challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I can be pretty like I've exploited the kind of move fast and break stuff thing pretty shamelessly. And because it's such a ridiculous thing, right? So it just lends itself to lampooning. But having said that, I'm not meaning to imply that we aren't fans of disruptive innovation. On the contrary, engaging with complexity actually does require this action reflection cycle, and which means that you actually have to try stuff out. We don't mean to imply that you should spend a whole bunch of time a priori planning and being absolutely precise about your plan and then doing the thing. If you are able, once you have a sufficient threshold of insights, to sort of follow some of those slow hunches and try stuff out, small probes or tests that allow you to sort of pull or push on a leverage point. This is one of the places where like planning versus like strategic planning versus systems practice diverge. You can try planning in complexity, but you cannot expect the results to mirror what the plan intends. The results of a system are what they are, despite your best laid plans. So you got to try stuff out. So this might sound like contradictory advice to like think before you act. But what we advocate is this kind of like low stakes, safe prototyping. Dave Snowden has a similar approach as well when he talks about you can't, in complexity, you can't plan in complexity. Complexity requires that you actually probe, sense, respond. Now, what does that look like, though? It could be as simple as meeting up with somebody who may have a bit more of a more experience, more of a wider ambit of experience around the system you're looking at, and trying an idea out for size. Say, I'm thinking of trying this out. Pay close attention to what these experiments are feeding back to you. This loop of action and reflection. It goes by different names. Some call it praxis, others call it action learning, others call it experiential learning. By the way, if you bring in not just like experiential learning, but sort of ethics-based or ethics-informed learning, then I think you're getting closer to that kind of Humboldtian objective of what's called Bildung, which is kind of like the personal growth, the personal transformation, which is kind of upgrading not just your knowledge, your kind of software, but you're upgrading your entire operating system by engaging in this type of action reflection cycle. It's meant to be unsettling. It never feels comfortable in the moment. Um, because you're constantly revisiting your assumptions if you're doing it well, and you constantly feel unsettled. It's not an enjoyable experience is watching a really amazing lecturer or a great TED talk, and you feel this pulse of like, you feel this almost rush of like, oh, that was really satisfying, but you actually don't grow much from that kind of learning. It has its place, but the best type of learning is when you're actually like on this on this precipice, on this edge. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I don't know what more I can say other than just dive in and do it. And don't let, there is a, like, one of the critiques of the book that we encounter is, oh, well, isn't this just lead to analysis paralysis? Um, and and I don't want that to be the takeaway. The takeaway should be the opposite in a way. It should be think and act much more bravely than you are currently. Um, and asking difficult questions is more brave than it might strike you when you actually start doing it. Um, because you uncover things about power, about motivations, about backstories, about histories, that are profoundly unsettling in many instances.
Great, thank you. Yeah, facing the challenges and facing the struggles of learning is not a nice thing, but it's what you come out of it with that is the nice thing, right? The treasure that lies in the learning process. So 100%, thank you. Another scenario, which yeah, I think is one of the number one questions that we have at the SI network is communicating systems thinking and complexity to individuals or companies or initiatives that are not familiar with these ideas. Challenging to say the least.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, so that's pretty fresh because when we actually launched this book, we counterintuitively launched it at a a really big innovation jamboree. There's about 3,500 attendees at this event that was like chock full of like, Silicon Valley types talking about like the latest tech innovation or lots of like disruptive this and disruptive that, and a lot. And I mean, and not to, I don't want to, a lot of it was really interesting and really valuable. Some of it was theater. But I think, yeah, it's a really critical and unusual kind of challenge. I would say for companies, for commercial entities, it's important to underscore that systems thinking, and more than systems thinking, deep problem understanding. That's the really important piece of this, is understanding the nature of problems. That is the missing piece of innovation. Innovation without problem understanding is like, it's like typing out like 80,000 random words and calling it a book. Um, there's there's little substance and absolutely no context. A market can be thought of as a place where problems seek solutions. So when you say, there's a market for this, it's shorthand for there are people who experience a problem and are in need of a solution to this problem. So in a commercial context, if you don't understand the problem, you don't understand the market. It's as simple as that. Um, I've spoken about why ATCO's drawn to systems thinking and problem understanding. Um, Corporate longevity, making wiser investments, talent acquisition and retention is a part of it as well, by the way. But they're not the first. Like in the 70s, Shell adopted a systems thinking approach, integrating it into their scenario planning process. Um, so the company was looking at not just sort of linear cause and effect relationships, but feedback loops, interdependencies, the sort of dynamic nature of the oil market. And so they would regularly draw up causal loop diagrams. This is 70s, 1970s. Um, and so this, some of this isn't new. It just never kind of had the kind of industry penetration that one might expect. There's also like case studies from Ford, P&G, Hewlett Packard, that have used systems dynamics modeling over the decades to forecast demand, optimize inventory levels. In the book, we talk about mini case studies of like Unilever and Google who use theory of change as a tool. There, of course, Toyota's famous example of using the five whys as part of, I mean, they developed it as part of their whole Kaizen approach to management. So, some of these things actually have industrial origins, and many of the tools in the book are from management scientists or organizational behavior specialists who moonlighted as consultants for Fortune 500 companies. So this shouldn't be seen as either exotic or navel gazing or somehow the purview just of like the social sector. This is useful for any kind of organization in any kind of context.
Awesome. Yeah, I think just thinking deeper about the problem is is a great way to put it, because we don't get limited by the word systems or the word complexity, all these big words. Then we invite people to think deeper, right? To think together and think with the problems that they already have. So this is, I think, is a great point to make it very achievable, but also creating that need to ask more questions as you go along, that curious
Mhm.
mindset. So that's a great point. Thank you. So last scenario before I hear from the audience, from you guys. There's a part of the book that says we have seen people explore problems and then give up, walking away because they realize just how complex the problem is. And I think that is very common, right? We go into a specific space thinking that, oh, it's going to be easy, and then we realize that it's a lot more complex than we thought, and we feel a bit pushed back by knowing there is a lot deeper than we thought it was. What are your thoughts on that, James?
Sure, Yasmin, there is a moment that froze just as you were beginning to describe that question. Were you speaking specifically of funders? I didn't get
Uh,
the.
the part of the quote from the book that says we have seen people explore problems and then give up, walking away because they realize just how complex the problem is.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say a couple of points around this. We say many times in the book that the way of the world is complexity. Complexity is the way of the world, and it has always been thus. Um, and so, a big problem that we're facing with modernity is our atrophied mental capacity to be comfortable with complexity. Um, And you know, I mentioned him earlier, but I would highly recommend, because I think it's one of the most, I think he's one of the most important thinkers alive right now, on trying to explain our current the mismatch between um, modernity and many of our really deep problems and why those exist. And that's Ian McGilchrist. And really focusing on like what what is it about our um, why are we not trusting the parts of our brain that allow us to appreciate and approach complexity? So a lot of this is what you might call the challenge of cognitive or perceptual complexity, um, where, yes, indeed, the world is very complex. There's 8 billion people now. There were 2 billion people at the end of the Second World War. There's also a kind of communicative complexity, uh, because we know stuff. We're connected on social media, so something that happens around the world is affecting somebody we know, or it's instantly on our feed. And so our brain is being filled with not just like local news, but what's happening everywhere. So there's many sources of layered complexity that are happening, both ontological or real complexity, communicative, but also like this kind of um, cognitive complexity, this felt load or burden. And I think you can't do anything about the ontological. You can do some stuff, you know, you can put away your devices, you can kind of shut down, you can do things that are about attending to your own health to shut down some of that communicative complexity. But I think the really important task in front of us is to trust the pieces of our own brain and our own thinking, that are not about having to understand all of the information and the data and the 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 categories. And you know, and I see this all the time. I see, you know, even talking about the book, depending on the venue, there are people that so many people obsess about definitions, about categories, about what's in what box, and frankly, it doesn't matter that much. It's, you know, we sometimes focus on grasping the specificity when the message as a whole is eluding us, and it's right there in front of us. And then that happens in life, in our workplace, in so many spaces. So I think it's a tough, it's a difficult question, but it's also a kind of multi-layered answer, that appreciating those layers of complexity and then approaching each one in turn may help. And so what, you know, what are the exercises for expanding your cognitive capacity for complexity? Well, you know, I think we still don't really have a good handle on that. Some advocate for meditation. That's probably very good and very worthwhile. You know, and mindfulness, embracing much more literature and art and culture in our lives. That's, I think, critical as well. Um, trusting, trusting qualitative and story-based and narrative information in a way that understands and contextualizes it as such. Uh, so that's a tricky one too, right? I'm not advocating for the trusting or the proliferation of alternative truths or 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 counterfeit truths, but um, to approach uh, whether it's a news story or an event or a pattern with a much more uh, open and solution agnostic point of view, so that you can appreciate where the different sides and different points of views are coming from. You may not choose a side. Like ultimately, and I don't want to suggest that systems thinking leads you always to a kind of mushy middle. Um, it should lead you to an appreciation of where people are coming from and why they have that opinion or why they have that viewpoint. Um, But in some cases, systems thinking might actually be radicalizing. It might actually, because you start to dig and ask questions and see things you didn't see before. And so the answer is complex. But hopefully that's of some help. I don't know.
Of course, yes, thank you. Yeah, it's always important to remind ourselves to sustain sometimes the complexity. Sometimes trying to get rid of the complexity or the difficulty straight away, just to have that clear path, doesn't allow us to sit with it. And I think that's how uh, arts and creativity are a very important part. It's a very important part of the conversation. We we allow ourselves to sit with um, somebody else's mind for a bit and understand more than the actual image can say. So that's very important as well. So yeah, great point. Thank you, James. I will just get one or two questions from the audience. If you would like to unmute yourselves and address any questions that you have, please feel free to do so. If you'd like to raise your hand, digital or physical hand, that will be great. I think there is a question here in the chat. Can go through that first. Yeah, there is a question here in the chat. I would really like to see an example of a project that was developed step by step using the different tools. Something I could use to inspire a group of skeptics to eventually make room on a bookshelf. Does anyone have a tip? Any comments in here?
So
Maybe thing or yeah, sorry.
chapter 7 is just for additional context is learning. How might you approach research? So this is a chapter that if you are already a researcher, this is not going to be very new. This is probably going to be a fairly cursory a kind of review of what research is and does. But we've really tried to say there's certain kinds of research and there's certain research practices that are especially useful when you're doing problem understanding or systems understanding. And so we spend some time with that. There's also an appendix at the end of the book that has some examples of places you can go. So we talk about like the kinds of research inputs, things like knowledge mobilizers, knowledge aggregators, meta-analyses, some systematic reviews, um, 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 the use of AI in systems research, looking at things like in the UK, you have What Works centers who've done really interesting compilations of research that is out there, and some have done evaluations of like what do we know about classroom learning? What helps in the classroom? Does mentorship help in the classroom? Does class size help? Do hours of the day make a difference? And so on and so forth. Or there's, um, centers of excellence or what work centers on policing, or incarceration or aging or all kinds of issues, youth recidivism. And so we include a lot of these resources as an appendix. So you can actually like look up, oh, okay, well, there's actually a corpus of research on that suggests that this family of interventions is probably going to be useless. And this one over here might actually hold promise. And that's something that actually surprisingly eludes a lot of change-making processes. When we often decontextualize or start with kind of, yes, context is important, local context is important, including the players is important, but we've seen many innovation labs or similar kinds of processes, collective impact processes, for example, not utilize research in some cases at all, in some cases very, very shallowly. And we don't ever want to imply that research is not important. Research is absolutely critical, including, but not just, academic research.
Yeah, I think the book is extremely comprehensive in many regards. So yeah, definitely an atlas to keep on coming back and reviewing. Thank you. So last
Just this may help with the question of like, are there examples of, I think the question is, have people used multiple tools in the same journey or in the same process to achieve change in system X, Y, or Z? And one of the recurring kind of cases that we use is Anna was quite involved in a food security process for a organization that she worked with, and a lot of those examples throughout the 30 tools we constantly come back to and revisit. So what happened? We had a version of the book earlier where every single tool had what did Anna learn from this tool? Because she used something like 15 of these tools. So there's many of those anecdotes. So you can see a thread in food security as one recurring theme as you start to get into the tools. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And last question from Joss.
Hi, James. Hi, Yasmin. Thanks for sharing this. James, great, really interesting. I guess, as you say, the core of the book is, spend 55 minutes trying to understand the problem, and then, the last 5 minutes taking action and learn and so forth. And there's a great quote kind of in the startup community: fall in love with the problem, not your solution, which I don't think is known well enough in the systems world, or generally, really, because I think it's a powerful idea. We normally go wrong as, in the social sector, for example, because we come up with a solution for addressing this problem and we fall in love with our solution, and we get egoistic ultimately about it in some sense, and we forget about the problem, right? And there's so many other people trying to address it. So I think that's very much, I mean, there's many other ways of kind of approaching what you're saying, what Einstein said and all of this. So I guess my question is, how do you actually, go about encouraging people to invest in that 55 minutes instead of jumping into the last 5 minutes? I don't know if I heard you speak about tips or tricks.
Yeah, it's not easy, and it's certainly not easy well, it's not easy in a commercial context, despite the fact that you're right, that quote came from the commercial startup context. We in the social sector, one of the, and it's a systems problem, of course, is many organizations receive funding, will receive grants based on how they've cast the problem, but also their solution to the problem, their intervention. And a good funder is interested in, what did you learn about the problem and about trying this out, and sticking, and actually a good funder should follow a lot of the principles and practices of venture capitalists who are more interested in like, what's the talent, the capacities, the adaptive capacities, the, you know, pick yourself up and dust yourself off after trying 5 different attempts, or five different, you know, slow hunches. That is not a widely practiced modus in philanthropy or in government funding. Certainly not in government funding. Some philanthropy there is, but the expectation is, well, you said you would do this thing, and I want you to measure how well you did it and how effectively. And if you didn't do it, well, there's some accountability that kicks in. And that's that very left brain kind of like, you got to measure what you did, and if you didn't get these right outputs, but if the organization actually discovers along the way, oh God, we were approaching it entirely the wrong way. We've learned so much more about this program. We want to do something completely different. Can we repurpose the funds? If you're a funder that says, no, you cannot repurpose the funds because we gave it to you for X and you want to do Y, you're part of the problem. And that's creating a culture of solutionism, and it's biasing, again, that kind of, you know, solving the wrong problem over. I mean, Russell Ackoff said, you know, people who you can either solve the wrong problem well, and that's a lot worse than failing to solve the right problem, which we should be doing. And so failure tolerance, uh, sticking with the capacities and capabilities of the investee versus the shallow metrics of, oh, you're going to try this intervention and we will wait and see whether this intervention actually works. That is not a great way to approach either investing or funding. And you know, that's another argument that can be invoked. I mean, I talked about the one around how you convince larger companies and what are some of those arguments that you can mobilize. And of course, using the examples that large companies not only have used these techniques over time, over many decades in some cases, but this is where some of the techniques come from in the first place. Because we experience, at least in North America, pushback mainly from the commercial sector on this stuff. Like, or maybe not pushback, but like skepticism, because there is that kind of like, there is that kind of, it comes across as analysis paralysis. It comes off as like, oh God, what are we, you know, why are we spending so much time understanding the problem? We just need to innovate. But innovation, of course, cannot happen without understanding the problem.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, because we went a bit over time, and I would just like to let people know, if you have something else to do, please. Thank you very much for coming, and yeah, for your attendance and your participation. But yeah, and thank you very much, James, for your book and for this great presentation and all the insights. And yeah, as always, I think we always need the second version of these conversations and these interviews, because it's never enough.
For sure.
But
Well,
yeah,
Yasmin, thank you so much for providing the platform. Again, huge thanks to all the work that your hub does, but also SI Network in general. It's a huge support to everyone around the world doing this stuff.
yeah, awesome. Thank you. And your book, I'm sure it's going to be very widely used and appreciated by everyone here, in the SI community and beyond, because it's truly an atlas and a great resource to have. So yeah, thank you very much for everyone to come here. Thank you very much, James, for your time. And yeah, we'll see each other next time. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye bye.